Are you a Mac user and ready to use Docker? Well, this lecture is going to get you all the tools you need to use this course with Docker and to get the best Docker setup on your Mac. So the nice thing is I'm going to be using all the demos, or at least most of the demos, on my Mac. So it'll feel very native for you. The required version of Mac isn't actually even recent, so you probably will be on the minimum version. It's actually a 3-year-old OS at this point on Yosemite. And really, Yosemite works on every Mac hardware for like the last 10 years. So as long as your laptop is less than 10 years old and you're using a version of Mac that was released in the last 3 years, the Docker for Mac product that you can get from store.docker.com will work. And it's the best way to use Docker on your Mac. It has all the features and all the new bonus sort of ease of use things going on in terms of like networking and storage and stuff. And we'll get into that. But that's really the best way to go. If for some reason you can't do that, maybe your office that you use your Mac from, it requires a Mavericks or one of the older versions like Lion or something. That's okay. There's still an option known as Docker Toolbox, which is sort of the legacy. It was actually the only version of Docker we could use on a Mac up until mid 2016 when they created Docker for Mac. So Docker Toolbox is still supported, still got the latest versions of Docker in it. It's just not going to have all of the nice little extra features and performance benefits of Docker for Mac. Other options for using Docker on your Mac include just installing it in a Linux VM. I mean, however you want to create a VM, do that, whether it's locally with VirtualBox or VMware Fusion or Parallels, or installing it on a Linux VM on the internet, on the cloud, right on AWS or Azure or DigitalOcean. So wherever you can get a Linux VM installed, you just can install Docker on that, and you can do 98% of this course that way. Other options include actually installing Docker in a Windows VM on your Mac. That might sound kind of weird. It's like too many layers of stuff going on, right? And actually that requires something called nested virtualization. So I don't really recommend it. I won't support it in this course, really. I won't talk about it. It is possible to make it work in case you, for some reason, just want to run Docker on a Windows machine on your Mac. I personally just do that for testing and demo purposes. But if you want to do that, it works with VMware Fusion. It does require a little special setting for nested virtualization, which means virtualization inside of virtualization. So you've got to get that working. But I'm told by the Docker team that it does work. And the last little option here, or tidbit, I guess, is that don't use Homebrew to install Docker. If you've actually already done that, you need to uninstall that Docker, because what that is the command line only. It's not going to actually have the Docker server or any of the other features that Docker comes with. It's only going to have the Docker command line tool. And that's useful if you want to use Docker to talk to a server remotely. But we're not going to do a whole lot of that in this course. We're going to focus on using Docker on your machine. So the setup process is going to basically go like this in this lecture. We're going to actually install Docker and then check out some of the settings or preferences for Docker for Mac and tweak those a little bit. And then we're going to download my GitHub repo that you're going to need in this course with all of the code samples and stuff. Then we're going to talk about code editors, and I prefer a specific one, Visual Studio Code, just because it works really well with Docker. But just about any one will work. Whatever favorite one you use will work fine. And then we're going to show some optional things where maybe you want to tweak your terminal or your shell setup in your Mac so that it works easier from the command line if you're going to be doing Docker stuff all day long. Okay, so let's get started with the install. So go to store.docker.com. As you can see, I'm already there. And everything in this course is focused on the free version, or the Docker Community Edition, Docker CE. So when this interface changes, because all interfaces changes on the web, right? You're going to have to find the Docker CE download area, and you'll see that there's an edition for all sorts of different OSs. And we're going to look for the Mac one, which happens to be at the top. And over here on the right, I have this Git download. Now, you can just click this, But you'll notice that also if you're an older version of Mac, it'll tell you, hey, the backup option is Docker Toolbox. But if we scroll down a little bit, we get two options. And I'm going to use the Edge version. The Edge is kind of like a beta, and I'm of course a tester, so I like testing the software and I'd prefer to see the new features first. But I find Edge actually to be quite stable, and with this product only being like a year old, I actually find that it gets the things I need, the new features or bug fixes faster as well. So I don't know, your experience may vary, and so generally I tell people if you're in an enterprise environment and you're looking to have your whole team on exactly the same version that you have in production and to sort of match all that up, then I'd say stick with stable. For everyone else, I say give Edge a shot. And if at any time you want to change these two, it's actually super easy in the interface to change built in from stable back to Edge and back and forth. So I'm going to do the Edge. And we're going to run that DMG file. And it should open up a screen that allows you to drag the Docker app into your applications folder like a typical Mac would. And it'll copy that over and allow you to run it. So you can close this window. We can actually close the web browser and go launch Docker. Now, the first time you run it, it'll give you this warning just simply because you're downloading it over the internet and not from the Apple Store. So go ahead and click open, but you won't get that after that. Now we're going to walk through the setup process. It's really easy. We're just going to click next, and it's going to ask us for root privileges, and then we're going to get a nice setup menu. And one of the options is you can sign in and create a Docker ID. It actually gives you some neat cloud services that we'll talk later in this course, but you don't have to do that right now. That's not a requirement. We're just going to wait for it to start, and you'll see up at the top it says Docker is now running. And you'll notice that it gives me a menu bar icon. So I can get lots of options from here, including everything from checking for updates to restarting Docker to exiting Docker. And by default, this thing will start every time your computer starts when you log in, and away we go. So before we go any further, I want to talk about a few preferences that you might want to change. One of them is I mentioned the option of switching between the Edge and the stable versions in case maybe you ever have an issue with Edge. You can actually do that here, and it will sort of remove your Docker VM and then create a new one. But so you don't want to do this every day, but in case you have a bug and you think maybe there's something to do with the Edge version, you can always switch back to stable. The second thing is whenever you're working with code that's on your host machine and you want to work with it in a Docker container, and this is known as bind mounting. We'll talk a lot about that later. But for now, just remember that when we get to that section, you need to make sure that your code, whatever you're going to use, is in one of these volumes or one of these directories on your Mac, I should say. And so really for me, I just make sure that my code is inside my user directories. And for me, that's /user/Brett. And for you, it's probably your username after the users. And so you notice that that's already in here. But if you're someone who makes a custom root directory on your Mac, you're going to need to add that in here with the plus symbol. Docker is actually on a Mac running a tiny VM in the background. It's running a tiny Linux VM. And that's because Docker doesn't run natively on the Mac kernel. Apple hasn't actually built in Docker functionality into its OS kernel. So we have to run this tiny little VM. And if you've ever run any virtualization, you know that you can give it however many CPUs and however much RAM. And I normally leave mine at the 2 CPUs of the 4 on my laptop, and then I usually ramp my RAM up to, like, let's say 4. You don't have to do that. It all depends on how much memory is in your system. I happen to have 16 gig of RAM on my Mac, so I have plenty of room to give it more access in Mac or in the Docker preferences. Do note, though, that Docker won't actually take up all of that RAM unless it needs it. So it's nice and conservative. That's the same thing with the space too. On the hard drive, it won't take up a huge amount of space. It'll only grow as it needs to. And so just because you're giving it 4 gig of RAM doesn't mean that it's not able to share that RAM with other applications on your Mac. It just means that Docker can use up to 4 gig of memory in my computer. And over here, I have to click apply and restart now that I've made that change. And there's lots of other options you can look at here and read about and actually see the help on inside the menu. But for now, let's just get into the command line. So I'm going to bring up the terminal. It's actually called Terminal. It's the Mac application. And if you're familiar with this, you may have all your own setup. If you're not familiar with Terminal, it is like PowerShell or Command Prompt in Windows and like a standard Linux shell in Linux. And it actually by default runs Bash, which is just a standard shell, very common, and you can see that it's here at the top. And I can actually run Docker version here to know that my Docker is running and which version of Docker I've got running here. So you can see the client and the server are both listed, and we'll talk in the next lecture after this section about what all that stuff means, but this basically getting this back does mean that your Docker is working and you can talk to it. So now that we know that Docker is installed and working correctly, let's clone my repository for this course. And if you're used to Git and GitHub, then this is a super easy part that you probably have done lots of times in your career, probably just this week, and it's no big deal. But if you're new to Git or specifically to GitHub, then let me just jump you through a couple of quick steps on the easiest way to get my repository downloaded. So in a previous lecture in this section, I gave you some information about where to find my repository and the link to it. It's at github.com/brettfisher/udemy-docker-mastery. That's a lot to type, so check out the previous lecture on cloning the class repository, and that'll get you to this directory. And right in here is basically you can actually view it on the web, but we need the whole thing on our local computer. So you would normally on GitHub come over here to the clone and download area, and I don't recommend you download the zip. The reason is that this course is fluid, right? Docker is always changing, they're always updating, and so this course will be as well. And you'll actually notice even on this page, you'll notice that like something changed less than a month ago, something changed 2 months ago. So things are fluid. And if you download a zip, it's not easy to update it once you're in the course. But if you open it in the desktop, it'll actually open it in the GitHub GUI and let you keep it in sync doing a git pull on occasion. And GitHub now has a new desktop, and once you've downloaded and installed that, you can actually jump back over to my repository and use several different options. You can click the Open in Desktop, which will open it in the GUI for GitHub, or you can copy the link and manually paste it into this GUI, and then you can put it on your local machine. The one important part here is that you want to make sure that you're putting it inside your user directory. So /users/Brett is my user directory on my Mac, and I just have a default standard of I put everything inside a code directory. The settings for Docker, as we mentioned previously, want to make sure that you have all the locations on your hard drive where you might put code that's going to be used inside a container. I won't cover that all again, but if you make sure that it's inside your user directory, then you're good to go. Once you've downloaded it, I would probably do a git pull once a month or so while you're still working on the course to make sure that you have all the latest fixes and updates as this course evolves. And while we're on the topic of this terminal works great. You can use it your whole career. There are lots of people that spend all day long in this particular terminal application. But in this course, you'll see me use one with a few more features known as iTerm2. And you can find that at iterm2.com. It's actually open source and free, and I actually donate money to them because I use it so often, and there's one gentleman that actually develops it, and I really like it. So from here, you're going to click the download and install it just like you would every other Mac application. And you can see that I have it here running on the right, and then I have the terminal actually running on the left, and I can do Docker version on this right side. And really, honestly, the only thing that I have different on my iTerm2 versus the standard terminal is I've customized it. I've changed the colors, I've changed the shell, and the options in there. You can actually find more out about that at brettfisher.com/shell. That'll come at the end of this lecture. I'll mention that again so you know where to go find it. But there's lots of little things and tweaks and stuff I do that you can go get. And as a reminder, none of that is required for this course. You can use the default terminal and the default CLI just like this through the entire course, and it'll work just fine. And the next little tip I want to give you is to check out Visual Studio Code. So if you don't have a preferred editor, you can check out Visual Studio Code. It's actually a free version of a code editor from Microsoft that's very similar to Atom from GitHub if you've ever used that. But it actually comes out of the box with a lot more functionality. And one of the nice things is it has a Docker feature that you can actually download as an extension. So you'll see that I've downloaded it and installed it already. And under this button on the left, there's an extensions option. And you can see that I have some basics like a spell checker, the Docker one, which is actually really handy in this course. It helps you with Docker files and compose files that you will learn about, and gives you syntax highlighting. And you'll see that commonly throughout this course. And I actually have a few other ones in there for different languages and tools. But really just the Docker one is the one that I recommend for this course. And so the last little thing we're going to go through is actually the command tab completion. So I'm going to bring up a new tab, and I'll give you the link in the end of this lecture and also in the resources for this lecture. But Docker has some great documentation on how to get the bash completion working. And what that really looks like is when I'm in a shell, and let me make this a little bigger for you, and I start typing a Docker command, Docker container, if I hit tab, I get the options of what I can type. And it helps me complete Docker commands. So I can do something like this, and I hit tab again, and I get a bunch of the options. So you can do this on your system too. And we can do that real quick simply by copying this after we do a few things. And all the instructions are here. So the first thing is, it says to use Homebrew. Well, what is Homebrew? If you're not familiar with Homebrew, it's actually another tool that, and this, by the way, again, all optional. You can download it from the Homebrew website, which is brew.sh. And what it is a command line tool that helps you install open source command line utilities with a one-liner. It's very similar to apt-get on Linux. PowerShell also has one on Windows. But basically, once you have it installed, you can just type brew install something, and it will go get that. So in this case, what they're saying is that you need to make sure you have the bash completion. So let's go through that real quick. So first install Homebrew using this command line right here, which I already have on my machine, but it will install the Homebrew application. And then from that terminal window, let me enlarge it for you, you can actually type brew install bash completion. And when I do that, it's actually going to download the bash completion and automatically set it up on my machine. Now I already have that installed, so when I hit enter, it's actually going to just tell me that it's already there. But for you, it'll actually install the bash completion and set it up so that you're good to go. Yeah, it says it's already installed. I'm going to clear my screen here. And then the next step is to actually link these three resources into your terminal. So I'm just going to copy and paste that, and those three lines will make permanent links. So that way, when I type now Docker container run dash dash and hit tab, you see that it gives me all the options again. And I can also start from the very beginning and just type Docker and hit tab twice to get all the options here, or I can type part of one and hit tab and it'll automatically complete it for me. So basically, I'm hitting tab all the time, right? And that's known as tab completion. It works out of the box in a lot of Linux distributions, but that's how you get it set up on Docker. I brought that into this lecture because a lot of people originally were asking me how to get that working, and Docker's documentation is pretty good on getting that started. Okay, to sum up this lecture, let's cover a few of the tips that I just talked about and also give you a couple of extra ones before we get started. So the command completion for your shell is totally optional, but it will help you. This link will actually be in the top left of your screen under the resources, and then you can jump over to the Docker documentation for that. We talked about where to store your code for the samples and the work you're going to be doing in Docker. I recommend just sticking it inside /users/your username on your Mac, that's the easiest place to do it. But if you do it somewhere else, you have to change the settings. And when you do that, we're going to get into the bind mount thing later, but just realize that you probably shouldn't use the bind mounts for databases. Really just use it for software code. That's really what it's meant for and works the best with. Next one is, we didn't talk about this at all. We will later in the course. Docker Machine allows you to create virtual machines on the fly with Docker built into them. And you can use that to create machines and manage them very easily, either locally on your Mac with something like VirtualBox, or even on the internet with Azure or DigitalOcean. So do check that out if you're interested in that. It's not required for this course, but it is yet another way that you can use Docker and manage it pretty quickly. We talked about the code editor for this course. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code a lot. I will also sometimes use Vim, but you can use whatever you want. There's no requirement for anything specific. It's really just text files we're going to be editing. And then we talked about iTerm 2 as a potential replacement for Terminal. I know lots of people that are professionals that use Terminal all day long. They're fine with it. I just happen to like some of the features in iTerm 2, and so hopefully you will too. It's open source and it's great stuff. And if you have any problems with your installation, definitely check out the docs at Docker's website. That link is fantastic. There is so much information there. I personally recommend you just read it eventually, because you'll learn more things about your Docker install on your Mac and how the Mac works with it. And lastly, my specific shell setup that I'm going to be using in this course happens to be the iTerm 2 plus not using the bash shell. It's something called omyzsh. And then I have a lot of other things. I change the colors. I have a little whale emoji in there. I do lots of stuff, right? But that's not going to distract you from the course. Like, don't think that you have to have all those things set up. But I do get a lot of questions from people on how my cool little shell is set up. And I do spend an obsessive amount of time trying to figure that thing out and make it perfect. So do check out, if you're interested in any of those add-ons, brettfisher.com/shell. I do list everything that I currently use in my shell setup in there. And someday I might make a full video on how to set each one of those up. But for now, it's really just a list of links and information about them. Okay, I hope you got Docker for Mac set up just the way you want it, and it's working great. If you have to use Docker Toolbox for the legacy option on Mac, do check out the lecture on Docker Toolbox for Windows. I know it's not Mac, obviously, but the Toolbox works the same way on Windows and on Mac, so that lecture will actually teach you how to use the Toolbox if you have to. But if you don't have to, highly recommend the Docker for Mac. Get it all set up, get the terminal working, and then jump to the next section to get started right now with Docker.